Welcome to BIV Today, the daily podcast from the Business in Vancouver newsroom. I'm Hayley Woodin, executive editor at BIV. It's Earth Day today, though increasingly politicians, businesses, organizations, and consumers think about the health of the planet every single day, factoring climate change into decisions around where to invest, where to live, and what to buy. What I want to focus on today, though, is on those politicians, specifically the climate-related commitments that were in or were not in both the federal and BC budgets that were released earlier this week. I'm joined today by Tam Wu, Regional Director for BC at the Pembina Institute. Karen, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Hayley.
Why don't we start with the BC budget? It's a little bit more recent, not by much. A lot in the budget for a broad range of sectors, but how much in the budget really focused on that sustainability or climate piece?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that fresh and at the forefront of everyone's mind right now is we're still in the midst of the pandemic. So obviously we're seeing light at the end of the tunnel with vaccines coming online and going into people's arms, but it's still very much the acute issue that everyone is paying attention to and also putting money towards. So the BC budget was heavy on COVID recovery. I think thinking back to around this time last year and as not as far back, but to this fall, the BC government did put out project out that recovery did have to include a climate lens and rebuilding back better and rebuilding a clean economy. They did put out their Stronger BC budget in the fall, and in that was $220 million that went towards climate initiatives out of a total of $1.5 billion for economic recovery. And then in this past Tuesday's budget, they built on those initiatives and put an additional $500 million towards climate initiatives. So they're not necessarily new initiatives, but it's building on previous ones. One of the things that we're particularly excited about is $60 million from the provincial government, bolstered by a $35 million injection from the federal government to establish a Center for Innovation and Clean Energy. Also, they announced $500 million for a strategic investment fund. And from what we can understand from this fund, it's a way for the BC government to invest in some small and medium-sized businesses in order for them to scale up and to advance reconciliation and diversity and inclusion goals, as well as climate goals. So there's a few interesting initiatives specific to advancing the goals of clean technology and clean energy companies in BC. Obviously, those are going to provide some really good opportunities for well-paying jobs and making sure that BC can capitalize on our clean technology and clean technology businesses that have currently found themselves here in BC. But the next part of the puzzle is really to get them to grow and expand and become competitive and global players in the clean energy future. I think one of the things that we would have liked to have seen more of is increased interest in building retrofits. This is an area that we think is a huge potential for businesses and jobs in BC, both from supply chain and manufacturing all the way through to folks who are designing green buildings and green homes, making them more energy efficient and using low carbon or non-fossil fuel based sources of heating, all the way to those who are wielding the hammers and nails to build those homes and retrofit them. So that is one area that we think is a missed opportunity.
And I understand retrofitting is also part of the federal budget as well. Before I ask you about the federal budget, how important is sort of a comprehensive retrofitting plan to Canada meeting its climate goals?
Our homes and buildings are a source of emissions, about 12% in Canada, about 10% in British Columbia. It's not necessarily something that we think about, but obviously when we turn that dial to heat our homes or that is a source of emissions, because most of our homes in Canada are heated with natural gas. Some are still heated by oil. And it's not necessarily something that we think about. So switching out our natural gas furnaces for electric sources of heating like heat pumps is one key thing. But heat pumps are not the most accessible in terms of cost to most Canadians. So we need to start finding ways to incentivize those choices, whether it's through government rebates, for example, And then the more people that adopt them, the niche will then become the norm. And so the price of heat pumps and that kind of technology will come down.
Yeah, and I think we often perhaps think about, LEED standards or other standards for new buildings, but it's easy to forget about, obviously, most of our housing in Canada is already built, and a lot of it is quite old and perhaps not up to the standards we would expect of new buildings today.
Exactly. And we do need to be retrofitting homes and buildings at an unprecedented scale right now if we are to reduce our emissions overall at a federal perspective, from a federal perspective, obviously. But just to give you a sense, in British Columbia, we need to be upgrading our homes and buildings on the rate of about 80,000 homes and apartments every year if we're going to hit our climate targets.
That's massive.
That is massive.
So you mentioned rebates, that's a piece of it, but do you think more needs to be done does it come down to the consumer and the homeowner to make these decisions? And is there maybe a role for regulation or legislation to that effect?
Well, the governments have been establishing rebate programs. I think the thing is that a lot of people aren't thinking about what kinds of technologies or what kinds of changes do I need to be making in my home. A lot of times when we think about home improvements, it's I want to slap on some new paint, I want to get stainless steel appliances, but it's not necessarily thinking about the mechanics behind the house. It's just not the forefront of people's minds in the same way of in choosing a new car can be. I think that a lot of times when we think about what the icon of making a clean or climate friendly choice is, I'm buying an electric vehicle as my next vehicle, not I'm installing an electric heat pump in my home. So awareness is one thing. The rebates are there, but the cost differential is still quite high, so that's an issue. Also, familiarity of contractors of the different types of heating systems is not as up to speed as could be. A lot of contractors are still pushing out gas furnaces, and I think that there needs to be more familiarity of electric heat pumps and making sure that they're properly installed, and what kinds of heat pumps that are available on the market is also an important part of the puzzle as well.
That's very interesting. I want to ask you more broadly about Ottawa's budget. What was in there that you find particularly inspiring or helpful to Canada meeting its climate-related targets, and what maybe wasn't in the budget that you would have liked to have seen?
Well, overall, I think it's easy to say we wish there had been more, but there is unprecedented amount of spending in the federal budget, no doubt. I don't want to undermine how much has been identified, but there's also a need to understand a bit more of the details of what was announced on Monday. So to give you a flavor, $4.4 billion going towards building retrofits. So that is huge. But to put that in perspective, as I had said, how many buildings need to be upgraded over the next few years or couple of decades in order to ensure that we meet our climate targets? It is a huge effort that is needed, and we're hoping that there is on the order of $10 billion needs to be invested, not necessarily from public money altogether, but we need to be able to secure that order of money in order to make sure that our buildings are retrofit. And with that comes hundreds of thousands of jobs. Like 127,000 jobs could be promoted in that level of investment. The federal government also put in $5 billion for a net zero accelerator. That's in addition to $3 billion, which was announced in their climate plan. So a total of $8 billion for net zero acceleration. Under that are things like 3 pillars, actually, to develop and adopt clean technology solutions, to support clean tech in Canada's aerospace and automobile manufacturing, and thirdly, to develop battery innovation. So those are some big ticket items. How that money gets divided among those 3 is yet to be seen, and what do they actually mean is also yet to be seen. But what we really want to be able to see is that we're investing in the highest and greatest impact projects to make sure that we are reducing our emissions in the short time that we have for us. There's also $1 billion announced for training with the lens of being just and an inclusive transition. with the idea that everyone can find a place in a clean economy. So we need to see some strong strategies to make sure that we're supporting workers and communities and integrating marginalized communities in this transition.
Canada has its sights set on net zero emissions by 2050. I'm still thinking about that stat you shared about retrofitting and just the scale at which we need to make some changes and reforms. Are we on track to meet that 2050 target?
Well, Justin Trudeau this morning says we're on track to blow past our 2030 target, but our 2030 target right now is pretty weak. So it's heartening to hear that Canada is going to be increasing our level of ambition. I think it's still yet to be seen if we are on track, because we need to understand how the government is going to be divvying up these amounts that I just described. I think that what we need to ensure is that the path to the short term of 2030 needs to make sure that we're leaving options open in order for us to meet our 2050 targets. So that means investing in the long term, not thinking about does a short-term solution like investing in the wrong type of technology that may only be available or useful to us for 10 years, then may mean that we're stuck with this kind of technology until 2050, when we could have just leapfrogged over into something that will make sure that we'll have a better chance of seeing us achieve our 2050 goals.
A lot of countries and companies, frankly, are focused on that 2050 with those important steps leading up to that target and that date. Is it appropriate? Is it helpful to think that far in advance? And by that, I mean, are we giving ourselves too much time to deal with what really is considered a crisis?
I think that's a really good question. And I think that it's easy to say, oh, we have lots of time until 2050. But like I said, we need to be thinking about what kinds of energy are we investing in, for example. Are we investing in renewable energy, or are we investing in a transition fuel? And how long do we think that transition fuel is going to be useful for? Or are we actually just prolonging what the transition period looks like? So we need to be quite quick and nimble in the decisions we make, or I should say we should need to be quick and also be nimble, knowing that technology is changing quite rapidly, and costs of new technology like renewable energy or electrolyzers for green hydrogen, for example, are coming down quite quickly. And we need to weigh that off with what is the capital investment for an incremental or intermediate technology.
Looking at the federal budget, but also some of the other plans that Canada has previously put in place, would you still consider us to be a global leader when it comes to tackling climate change?
I think that in 2015, when we went to Paris, we were seen as a global leader. We were involved in the negotiations to ensure that the parties, or to encourage parties to sign on to the agreement that said we will strive towards 1.5 degrees. A lot has changed since then. And I think in particular, Joe Biden becoming president and coming out strong with his jobs plan that is projected to put in trillions of dollars into infrastructure spending, of which clean infrastructure and a green economy is so much part and parcel of his vision. I think that the US is set to catapult past Canada and hopefully bring along the rest of the big emitters with him.
Is there potentially an opportunity that's going to be missed here, that Canada was perhaps, or was certainly ahead of the US in terms of what it was doing around climate action at one point in time, has made investments, but if we're going to be eclipsed by just the sheer volume and amount being invested south of the border, is there a lost opportunity in terms of businesses that could have been, or innovation that could have taken place here?
I think that's always a risk. I mean, I think that what we might end up doing is riding the coattails of the US. They're such a huge economy that, for example, if they're saying we are getting really serious with electric vehicles, that then helps push our manufacturing forward. Our vehicle manufacturing is so integrated that we could benefit from that. On the other hand, there's a lot of things that we could be and should be capitalizing on from a clean tech perspective. In a global clean tech scan of the companies across the globe, 12 of them were based in Canada. and 12 of the top 100 companies were based in Canada. So it's the idea of that, for example, the BC government had of partnering with and supporting small and medium companies to scale up, which is a lot of these clean tech companies. How do we take that knowledge and that innovation and ensure that we are on the global stage? So if we aren't investing in the right things, or we're not attracting the right in private investment and directing innovation with a certain vision, we could very well miss the bus.
And I think too, just scaling up our companies and our technology here to be able to sell to the US market, you need to be at a certain level and at a certain size to really seize that opportunity.
Absolutely. Carbon Engineering, which is based in Squamish, is one of those companies that we hear a lot about. They are working in the US and they're working here in Canada. And it's companies like that that we need to be supporting and making sure that we do have our own homegrown success stories, that we are exporting our knowledge, not necessarily our products.
A final question for you, Karen. Of course, as we've been dealing with the COVID crisis, we also have this climate crisis that preceded it. Is there any learning we can take from how we mobilize to address COVID-19 and apply it to something like the climate crisis?
Absolutely. I think that the word that you use, mobilize, is one of the key lessons. Is we have seen how governments can mobilize the right resources to find a solution if the political will is there. We didn't have a vaccine a year ago, and it was unheard of to develop a vaccine as quickly as we have. If we can mobilize that kind of political will and that kind of money behind finding a solution to a significant global problem, we should be doing that for climate as well.
Do you get the sense that that movement is starting to come in response to climate? I just think about over the past year, the number of announcements, companies coming out that they're going to be producing all electric cars by such and such a date, new commitments around could be divesting in certain portfolios. Do you feel that that change is starting to happen, and is it happening quickly enough?
There certainly has been a shift in terms of commitments that companies and countries are coming out with. Nearly 130 companies or countries around the world have said that they want to be or are committed to becoming net zero. And a lot of big name brands and companies that are heavy polluters have also made the same commitment. So there is that hope. I think what it comes down to is, what does netting out to zero look like, and what does it actually mean?
And I know I said final question, I just keep coming up with the follow-ups, but do you have a definition in terms of what that should look like? What does netting out or getting to net zero mean?
Well, I think a really important part is, or to think about, is making sure that we are, first and foremost, doing real reductions at the source of emissions. So that is number one. And really reducing where we absolutely can reduce our emissions, whether it is switching off of fossil fuels and using clean electricity wherever possible. And there are a lot of technologies that we can do that already. We can heat our homes with electricity. We have electric vehicles. But there are some really difficult areas that we don't quite yet have the technology. We don't know what the solution might look like that can work everywhere. So heavy duty vehicles, heavy trucks, for example, that's still a puzzle for us. How do we shift processes in industry like steel making, so that we're not using fossil fuels? So there is a cleaner way to make steel and cement, for example. Where we don't have those technologies in 20 years time, 30 years time, that's that small sliver of fossil fuels that might still be used. That's the part that we need to net out. So we are using carbon capture technology, or we're using nature-based solutions. And that to me is what netting zero really means.
Thank you for that. And Karen, thanks so much for joining our show with your insight. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
That's Karen Tam Wu, Regional Director for BC with the Pembina Institute. I'm Hayley Woodin, and this has been BIV Today. Thanks so much for joining us. Our show will be back with a new episode tomorrow.